Hello, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk on assessment. What I'll be doing, in fact, is taking an overview of assessment in physics departments based on the book I'm shamelessly publicising, which recently came out in May of this year. Looking at the talk, there's the plan of it. Rather than looking in detail at particular assessments, I'll be taking a broad overview, looking at purposes, the principles, some of the assumptions that we make, that we don't need to make, and looking in detail actually at comparability of standards, and finally introducing some emergent issues that I found from looking at the book. I shall be trying to challenge your views of assessment. So going straight into the purposes. The purpose of assessment, and by purposes here I mean the purposes to which assessment is put rather than the purpose we would like to have it by definition. And first one, of course, is classifying students. Students want to have a qualification. Employers use qualifications in determining who they interview. Starting salaries can depend on qualifications, and of course postgraduate admissions and whether you get a grant from a research council. These all depend on qualifications, and of course we have the same classification system across essentially all universities, first 2-1s, 2-2s and so on. There's a common system which is used, and that's what the employers and postgrad admissions tutors use. A couple of questions immediately come to mind. Is the system consistent? Are the assessments consistent between subjects? And the second question is whether or not between institutions in the same subject. And I don't think anyone would really say that the answer to those questions is yes. It's no and no, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Another purpose, and again it's not a purpose we would want, but it's certainly a purpose we have, is that the standards are relevant for quality assurance. So the standard of an education, the standard of degree awards if you want. Perhaps standard isn't the right word, just the number of degree awards. And of course, you've got league tables. The popularity of universities can be determined by the league tables that you find in some newspapers, Sunday Times, The Guardian, or some online websites as well do the same thing. And some of those, not all of them, but some of them use the percentage of firsts as an indicator of quality of a particular degree programme. I don't think any of us would agree with that, but it's what happens, and parents and students look at those league tables, so it matters. The teaching excellence framework, again, failure rates are penalised, so admittedly not the degree award, but the first year to second year progression rates are penalised if they're low by the teaching excellence framework. And of course, we also are subjecting quality assurance to the National Student Survey, which itself can contribute to the TEF. And it's simply that happy students will be even happier if they have high marks. So none of these things are contributing to what I'd call a quality check on standards. They're all pushing in the same direction with almost nothing pushing back. And perhaps unsurprisingly, if you look between 2011 and 2018, as in the table, this is all pre-COVID, so that doesn't really change anything. You see that over a 7-year period, the percentage of degrees that were first class has almost doubled. And in 2018, almost 80%, almost 4/5 of degrees were good degrees, to the extent that students are starting to think that if I don't get a first or a 2-1, then they've failed in some way. Another purpose is benchmarking. We were familiar with benchmark assessments in all sorts of ways. Driving test is the most obvious, but there are other things like online health and safety tests that we do to see whether we know how to use a computer properly, for example. It's not something that we do a great deal of in physics degrees. It could be used, for example, assessing how well a student can use a piece of apparatus. Even in theory modules it could be used in a mastery learning approach. But because benchmarking is either a pass-fail, you don't get marks, and so you can't add the marks, so they tend not to be used, these type of assessments, which I think is a pity, because I think that can add a great deal to the way we educate the students. And the most important purpose of assessment is promoting and measuring learning. That's what we want assessment to do. We want the students to do what we want them to do in the learning outcomes, and of course the assessment drives that. Formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment is assessment where the students get feedback. It doesn't always count towards the degree. And of course, not only the students get feedback, but the staff get feedback on how well the students have been able to cope with the work that they've been given, or the teaching that they've had. A couple of questions there. Do students these days with fees, do the students prefer a good education, or do they prefer having a good qualification? The two are not mutually inconsistent, of course not. But which would the students go for with a choice? I have a feeling it might be the qualification. And as a result of that, and I have plenty of experience of this with colleagues as well, reporting similar behaviour, that if it doesn't count directly, if you give an activity which might be formatively assessed, if you give them an activity which is not counting to their degree, they don't always engage with it. Some of them they just walk out. Others may stay, but they don't engage with it as much as they might. And you can see that these different purposes can lead to tension. Some of them are pushing standards down in the sense that universities benefit by giving higher level degrees. Principles of assessment, these are fairly straightforward. They're principles of any sort of assessment at any level. Where I've written things in red, these are the things where I feel there are some questions to be asked. I don't think that the assessments currently used in physics departments are closely relating the assessment to the learning outcomes. You can show that they do relate, but I don't think they're particularly relating. I'll come back to that point later. Assessment should be transparent. Authenticity means it should be related to the nature of the subject. So in physics, one of the quintessential features of a physicist is to be able to solve problems synoptically, and I don't think that's happening. I don't think we're testing that sort of problem solving in physics degrees. Accurate and consistent. Well, traditional exams, you do get errors creeping in and lots of ambiguity actually. But the good news is, or perhaps it's the bad news, but the good news is that the ambiguity doesn't matter that very much, because most of the exams depend on rote learning. So even if the question is ambiguous, the students know what's required because it's usually some aspect of what's been written in their notes. So it doesn't really matter very much. But consistency of qualitative work, particularly projects, is more of a problem. And of course, projects in any degree, but particularly in the 4-year degrees, the MPhys, MSci, do provide a great percentage of the final year mark. And if they're not being marked consistently, that's something we should be worrying about. And the final point of achievable, so it must be matched to the ability of the class, and I'll come back to that later. Also achievable in terms of staff time, we should never forget that. The fewer implicit assumptions that are made, none of which, they're all plausible, but none of which are really fixed. And I think these assumptions can lead to constraints on the type of assessment processes we use. So marks are sacred. We assume the marks are sacred. You get a mark, you can't lose it. Whatever happens, you can't lose that mark. Really, nothing. A mark is just an indication. It's a number on how well the student has done against some ideal performance. Marks must be added linearly. That clearly counts against benchmark type assessments. And assessments should always have a good spread of marks. Not really, not if all the students have done as well as they might, for example, again, in a benchmark type assessment. So comparability and standards. I've mentioned already it's virtually impossible to compare standards between subjects. I don't even know where I'd start to do that. But even within a single subject, and one in physics where we have accreditation, which tends to level the playing field quite a lot, different universities are doing different things. Some courses might be more mathematical, some might be more practical. Then the standards are different. They're not better, worse, they're different. But despite all of that, we do have a common system of degree classification, as we've seen. And the universities go to great lengths, we'll come on to this in a minute, go to great lengths of defining what they mean by first 2-1 and 2-2. So what's happening here? Are we being honest with ourselves? I don't think we are. So to discuss that in a little bit more depth, we have norm versus criterion referencing. So norm referencing is when marks are awarded or degrees are awarded according to the relative position of a person to the mean of the class. And the obvious example of norm referencing is IQ. By definition, the average performance across a set of IQ tests is 100. So an IQ of 100 means you're at bang average, and you'll be above average, you'll get a higher IQ. If we apply that to a university system, it would remove grade inflation at a stroke, of course. But it would mean that the performance of a student was relative to the performance of the other students in the cohort. And most of us would see that as unsatisfactory. On the other hand, criterion referencing, you forget about the relative performance and you match the performance of the student to some predefined criteria, whether it's the model answer in an exam or some qualitative criteria, which we'll look at in a moment. That has a great advantage. The student marks are independent. And of course the students can relate their marks to specific achievements, and it's what we think we do and it's what we say we do. The problem is we don't. Assessment standards are deemed to be criterion referenced, but in practice they're norm referenced. What do I mean by that? You may be saying, I don't believe you, it's not. Well, when you set an exam paper, you set the standard of the paper, the level, based on historical precedent to suit the students in the cohort you have. And when you're marking it, if it seems to be a bit hard, you're a bit more generous. We all do this, we're human. And even examiners are often told to target their paper to a particular average mark, 60, 65%, whatever it might be. That's all norm referencing. So do we use criterion referencing at all? Yes, we do. We use it once we've set the standard by norm referencing, we use it to distinguish between the students, the classification purpose of the assessment. We use that to distinguish between the students in terms of how well they answer the questions. In short, we assess and classify the students we have. If we look at some of these assessment grids, these criteria, here's one, which is a fairly esoteric one, actually, looking at the way the student is prepared for a particular interview. We see a number of aspects. There are three particular aspects I want to look at. First of all, the centre of gravity. There are 3 first-class grades, 3 non-first-class grades. Anyone marking will get the impression that, you know, half the class should be getting first-class grades. That's just a sort of psychological aspect. Another one is, which this one isn't too bad on actually, but if you look at the lowest descriptor, you see that it's all explained in terms of negative attributes. You're not saying what the students can do, more or less saying what the students can't do. That's a very common feature of these grids. And perhaps the most important feature of all is the use of synonyms. So if we look at the top 3 grades, look at the exceptionally well prepared, carefully planned approach, comprehensive understanding, excellently prepared, thorough understanding, very well prepared, clear understanding. These just don't distinguish. They're more or less synonyms. And also you get into a circularity. So when we look at 80 to 89%, that's excellence. There's no doubt that that's a high mark showing excellence. How do we define excellent? Excellently prepared, completely circular. And this is a very common feature of all these criteria. Here's another example from a different university. See the centre of gravity again. Here, the 50 to 59%, 2-2 level, defined almost entirely in terms of what the students can't do, rather than what they can do. Limited results, poor technique, and so on. Another feature, if you look at the top end, for 70 to 84, results are performed at the optimum level. And in my book, optimum means the best possible. But if you look, there's a grade above that. Results are consistent with those expected from a skilled first-year PhD student. It sort of begs 2 questions. One is, how can a PhD student do better than optimum? And secondly, do we know what the performance of a skilled first-year PhD student? These seem to make sense, but when you analyse them in depth, they don't make any sense at all. So defining excellence, this is a global example. So this is defining what we mean by the very best person in the very best performance in a physics program. And if you look at this, it does indeed have many of the qualities we'd want from a first-class student. comprehensive subject knowledge, applies information, analyses data, great proficiency in solving problems. I've said that's a quintessential feature of a physics graduate. Communicates logically, insight and originality. This is exactly what we would want from a first-class student. However, it's the descriptor for a school-level qualification that people take at age 18. It's the Science Bac, Science Baccalaureate, which is taken in many schools and colleges these days. And it works at that level, just as it works at our level. The point I'm making here is not that this isn't a good description, but that without a detailed description of the standard at which we're operating, the level at which we're operating, criteria like this have no meaning whatsoever. So you could define a set of criteria that would define first class in physics, but you'd have to go to such detail that it really wouldn't be worth the trouble, and no one does, in fact. A final point here are really the emergent issues that I've found from writing the book. These are things that I think are a problem and that do need addressing in some way. So traditional exams are almost entirely a test of rote learning. Some are better than others, but on almost every written exam you can get a first class mark purely by rote learning. And on top of that, I think over a period of time, as the student voice has become more important, measures such as circulating printed notes in advance of the lectures, giving answers to all the worked answers to all the problem classes or problem sets that students have been given, they reinforce the notion for students that what they need to do is to rote learn material. I have no doubt about this. It comes through very, very clearly. And we do need to ask ourselves whether this is the right thing we should be doing. As a result, partly as a result of that actually, but more generally, assessments are not matched always to the learning outcomes. So I think the reason that this happens is that what we tend to do when we're designing a course is to sort of build the modules first. We decide the content, we split things up into modules, and then, if we think about it at all, we think about how we might assess those modules. I think that's completely incorrect. I think the way to do it is to start by deciding the learning outcomes, what you want the students to be able to do, and indeed to know at the end of their programme, and then build the assessments in, then decide how those outcomes are going to be assessed, and then chop up the programme into modules if you need to do that, so that the assessment is built in, linked to the learning outcomes rather than as an afterthought as to how we might assess a module. I've mentioned already the inconsistency in marking project work, and looking at the grids I produced, you can see how that will happen. That if you have lots of different people using the same grids, they will not use those grids consistently. It is almost impossible for them to do so. And with projects counting a very large proportion of the final year of degrees, particularly the 4-year programmes, MPhys and MSci, that's a major problem. Sanctity of marks I've mentioned. I'd like to see the benchmark approach being used much more so that students build upon their ability to do things throughout the programme rather than just having a global mark, global set of marks which are just added together. I mentioned the student voice leading to conservatism, and then there's the big question about whether the students want an education, the best education or the best qualification, and often their voice tends to make life easier for them rather than anything else. And grade inflation I've talked about. If we're going to use degree grades in everyday life for admissions and for starting salaries and so on, we really do need to sort that out. And I do have some fairly revolutionary ideas on how to do that. But I'm not going to tell you those ideas. There are some suggestions in the book. But I thought it might be a good idea to leave that open for the discussion and to see where that takes us, and perhaps we can air a few of those ideas as we go along. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to discuss this further and answer any questions.